Welcome to Strong, Confident, and Informed, the podcast where we go beyond surface level fitness advice and actually help you understand what's driving your results. I'm Danielle Lemoyne, an online fitness coach who helps women build strength, lose fat, and most importantly, stay consistent without constantly starting over. And today we're talking about eating like the version of you who gets results. Before we talk about food, macros, or habits, I want to clearly define what this call is actually about. This is not a diet talk, and it's not a set of rules, and it's definitely not about being good or bad with food, okay? What we're talking about today is skill development. Eating well consistently is actually a skill. And like any skill, it can be learned, practiced, refined, and strengthened over time. Most people believe that consistency with nutrition is something you either have or you don't. They tell themselves stories like I'm just not disciplined, or I always fall off, or I'm good for a few weeks and then I lose it. But that framing is misleading and unhelpful. You wouldn't tell someone they're a failure because they can't deadlift perfectly the first time they touch a barbell, right? You'd recognize that strength is built through those repetitions, through coaching and progressive exposure. Nutrition works the same way. What I want you to understand is that your current eating habits are not a verdict on you as a person. They are simply feedback on the systems you currently have, or maybe don't have in place. If your nutrition feels chaotic, inconsistent, or emotionally charged, that doesn't mean you lack willpower. It means the skill hasn't been trained properly yet. And skills improve when we slow down, understand the mechanics, and practice it intentionally. So, as you listen today, I want you to shift out of a judgment mindset and into a learning mindset. Instead of asking, why am I like this? I want you asking, what is this showing me? Now, we're going to have a few different moments in this episode where I'm going to tell you to reflect on things. You can feel free to write this down, or you can simply ask it yourself and try and remember. I highly recommend writing it down. Here's your first one. Consistency with food is a skill I am learning, not a trait I lack. Now, this episode is about giving you the tools, language, and understanding to start practicing that skill in a way that actually fits your real life. One of the biggest mistakes people make when they think about nutrition is assuming that eating well fails because of lack of effort. In reality, nutrition almost never breaks down because people don't care. It breaks down because life applies pressure, and the systems people rely on aren't built to handle that pressure. Think about your good days versus your real days. On calm days, when you're well rested, you're not rushed, emotionally regulated, most people eat just fine. Meals feel easier, decisions feel clearer, hunger feels manageable. But those days aren't the problem. The problem is what happens when stress enters the picture. When you're tired, overwhelmed, emotionally taxed, or mentally overloaded, your brain does not prioritize long-term goals. It prioritizes relief. Under stress, your nervous system shifts towards survival mode, and survival mode looks for fast energy, comfort, and familiarity. This is when protein tends to disappear. This is when meals turn into snacks. This is when planning feels exhausting and the I'll deal with it later takes over. None of that is a character flaw, it's physiology. What usually follows, however, is guilt. People notice their eating feels off. They feel frustrated with themselves. They assume the solution is to clamp down harder. But guilt does not improve your regulation. In fact, guilt often increases inconsistency because it keeps the nervous system activated and reactive. This is why people feel stuck in cycles of on and off. And I want you to pause here and reflect, not to judge. Write this down. When my nutrition breaks down, what is usually happening in my life at the same time? When you understand why nutrition collapses, you stop trying to fix it with force and start fixing it with structure. Now, let's talk about food, but not in the way most people do, okay? Macronutrients are not just numbers you track in an app. They are signals you send to your body. Each macronutrient plays a specific role in regulating your hunger, energy, recovery, mood, and your consistency. When one of them is missing or inconsistent, the entire system becomes harder to manage. Now, let's start with protein. Protein is often talked about in terms of muscle, but its role goes far beyond that. Protein is the most powerful tool you have for appetite regulation and stability. When protein intake is consistent, hunger becomes predictable. Energy feels steadier, your cravings soften, you don't feel like you're constantly negotiating with yourself around food. When protein is inconsistent, hunger feels more urgent instead of gradual. Snacking tends to increase, and people often describe feeling out of control, even though what's really happening is a biological imbalance. Carbohydrates. Carbohydrates are another area of confusion, especially for women. Carbs are not just workout fuel, they are nervous system fuel. When carbohydrate intake is chronically low, stress tolerance decreases, training feels harder, recovery tends to suffer, and cravings tend to show up later in the day. This is why many people feel good all day, only to unravel later at night. The body isn't sabotaging you, it's actually compensating. Now, fats, dietary fats, they play a different but equally important role. Fats slow your digestion and increase your satisfaction. They help meals feel complete. When meals are too low in fat, people often finish eating and they still feel unsatisfied, which tends to lead to grazing, snacking, or searching for something else. Now, satisfaction is not overeating, it is a biological signal that tells your brain it's safe to stop. So I want to pause here and reflect for a minute. Which macronutrient do you tend to under-prioritize? Protein, carbs, or fats? And how does that show up in your hunger and your energy? Understanding macros at this level removes blame and it replaces it with clarity. Now, let's start talking about our identity. This is where everything comes together. Because even with all the nutritional knowledge in the world, people still struggle if their identity hasn't caught up to their goals. You do not need to eat based on what you know. You eat based on who you believe you are, especially under stress. If deep down you see yourself as someone who struggles with food, your actions will reinforce that belief. Every skipped meal, off-plan night, restart, all that becomes evidence. And over time, that identity becomes self-protective. And we start to say things or think things of, this is just how I am. But identity is not fixed. Identity is built through evidence. And evidence is built through repeated actions, even your small ones. So the version of you who gets results, she's not extreme. She's not rigid and she's not perfect. She is consistent in boring and unglamorous ways. She eats protein even when she's busy. She fuels earlier instead of restricting all day. She plans meals because she respects her future self. And when things aren't perfect, she responds calmly instead of emotionally. The important part here is this. You don't become that version of yourself before you act. You become her by acting like her repeatedly. Identity follows behavior, not the other way around. Waiting to feel ready often keeps people stuck, but acting in alignment, even if it's imperfectly, is what creates change. So, you can write this down and reflect on it. What kind of eater do I currently believe I am? And what kind of eater am I practicing becoming? because this is the bridge between information and transformation. Now that we've talked about physiology and identity, we need to talk about execution, because this is where most people get stuck. Habits don't change because you want them to. They change because the environment, structure, and decision rules make the desired behavior easier than the old one. If your nutrition relies on motivation, it will fail the moment life gets busy. Sustainable habits are built on systems, not feelings. One of the biggest reasons nutrition feels exhausting is because there are too many decisions. What to eat, when to eat it, how much to eat, whether it's good enough. Every decision costs mental energy. By the end of the day, that energy is gone. And that's when the default behaviors start to happen. This is why simplifying your meals is not lazy. It's strategic. Repeating meals, rotating a short list of options, and planning protein ahead of time is not boring. They are how consistency is built. Habit change also requires lowering the bar to consistency. People often think change requires doing more, but in reality, it usually requires doing less, but more often. One protein-focused breakfast repeated 5 days a week will move you more forward than 5 perfect days followed by a crash. Habits grow through your repetition, not through your intensity. And this is where identity and habits begin to meet. Every time you repeat a small, aligned action, maybe it's eating protein at breakfast, packing a balanced lunch, eating instead of skipping, you collect evidence. And that evidence starts to reshape how you see yourself. You stop being someone who tries and start becoming someone who follows through. So here's a question you can ask yourself. You can write this down and reflect on it after if you'd like. What is one nutrition habit that, if repeated most days, would make the biggest difference for me? This is not about fixing everything. It's about choosing the right leverage point. One of the most common and misunderstood issues I see in coaching is chronic underfueling earlier in the day. This is especially common in women who are trying to lose fat or be good with their food. Breakfast is usually light or it's skipped. Lunch tends to be rushed or more snack-based. We've all heard of this snack girl lunch. And by the evening, hunger feels intense, cravings tend to spike, and control feels harder. Now, this isn't a lack of discipline. It's biology responding exactly as it should. When you undereat earlier, blood sugar drops and hunger hormones increase. So your body perceives scarcity. By the time the evening arrives, your nervous system is no longer interested in your long-term goals. It's trying to restore balance as quickly as possible. This is why nighttime eating often feels urgent and more emotional. The body is compensating for earlier deprivation. And now, eating enough earlier in the day is not about eating more overall necessarily. It's about eating appropriately and strategically. A protein-containing breakfast within the first 1 to 2 hours of waking helps set the tone for appetite regulation. A real lunch, not just snacks, stabilizes your energy and prevents the evening crash. When this foundation is in place, dinner becomes a normal meal instead of feeling like a battleground. And many people fear that eating earlier will stall fat loss, when in reality, the opposite is often true. Earlier fueling leads to fewer binges, less emotional eating, and more consistent intake, and even better training, performance, and better recovery. Calm evenings are not created by restriction. They are earned through nourishment earlier in the day. I have another question for you. Once again, if you're writing things down, this is a great one to reflect on. Do I eat breakfast and lunch like someone who trains and wants results, or like someone who is trying to diet. This awareness here alone can absolutely be transformative. Now let's talk about what happens when things don't go to plan, because they will. We all know that. Progress is not built by avoiding off meals, okay? It's built by how you respond to them. Most people don't derail their progress with one meal. They derail it with reaction that follows. The most common reaction to an off-plan meal is usually emotional. You're feeling guilt, frustration, or shame. That emotional response often leads to compensation. Either you're skipping meals, you're restricting the next day, you're adding extra cardio, or you're mentally feeling like you're starting over. While this might feel productive, it actually reinforces the cycle. Restriction increases hunger, hunger increases cravings, and the loop continues. The skill we're practicing instead is a neutral response. And a neutral response sounds something like this. That was one meal. Back to normal. There's no punishment, no compensation, no moral judgment, just a return to your usual structure. This response keeps the nervous system regulated and prevents one meal from turning into several days of inconsistency. Emotional eating also deserves a bit of a reframe here. Emotional eating is not a failure. It's information. It often signals underfueling, exhaustion, stress, or a lack of planning. When you treat it as data instead of a flaw, you gain some insight into it. You can start to ask better questions. Was I eating enough earlier? Was I overwhelmed? Did I plan for that hard day? That is how the pattern gets interrupted. So ask yourself, when an off-plan meal happens, what's going to be your response? Is it going to be, that was one meal, back to normal? Or is it going to be emotional? This single skill protects long-term consistency more than any diet rule ever will. And I want to be very clear about expectations moving forward for yourself, not to pressure you, but to support growth. As your coach, my rule is not to police your food or micromanage your choices. My role is to help you see patterns, adjust systems, and build skills that last beyond short-term phases. That means I typically look at trends, not isolated days. I focus on consistency, not perfection. We talk about what's actually happening, honestly, so we can problem solve effectively. What doesn't help is passivity. Waiting for motivation, avoiding reflection, or disengaging when things feel hard only keeps the cycle going. Your role as a client is participation. Participation looks like reflecting instead of judging. It looks like practicing one or two habits consistently instead of trying to overhaul everything. It looks like bringing awareness to check-ins so we can work together strategically. It's not about doing things right. It's about staying engaged in the process. Leadership in your own journey means taking ownership of patterns without shame. It means recognizing that progress comes from repetition, not from perfection. And it means being willing to practice even when things aren't ideal. So what is one nutrition habit that you're willing to practice consistently this month, even when life is busy? That commitment matters more than any plan will. So as I finish this episode, I want to tie everything together for you. This episode wasn't about giving you more information. It was about giving you clarity and direction. You now understand why nutrition breaks down, what your body is asking for, how identity influences behavior, and what skills actually move the needle. You don't need to be perfect. You need alignment. Identity follows action. Act like her repeatedly and let consistency do the rest. If this episode resonated with you, come hang out with me on Instagram at DL Fitness Coaching. Send me a message and let me know what landed for you. And if you're ready for support applying this in your own routine, you can find all the details about my coaching in the show notes. Thanks for being here, and I'll talk to you in the next episode.